In the last lecture, we saw the importance of situating Jesus in his own historical context. Jesus was not confronted with the problems and concerns of the English-speaking world at the beginning of the 21st century. And if we pretend he was, for example, by thinking that his sayings were addressed directly to our situation, then we simply take him out of context. And whenever you take something out of context, you alter its meaning. Jesus was a first-century Palestinian Jew. To understand him, we need to know something about the historical and social context of Judaism in his day in Palestine in the first century. Last time, we considered some of the political history of Palestine as a history of foreign subjugation, and we looked at the consequences of this subjugation in the formation of Jewish sects within Palestine. Sects that by no means comprised a majority of the Jewish population, but that did nonetheless exercise considerable power, and that represented religious options for Jews living at the time. To summarize the perspectives of these sects as simply as possible, the Pharisees emphasized keeping the law of God to the fullest degree possible, and developed a set of oral laws to assure that they did so. The Sadducees emphasized worshiping God in the temple in strict accordance with requirements set out in the Torah, the law of Moses found in the Hebrew Scriptures. The Essenes emphasized maintaining their own purity in light of the imminent apocalypse, in which God would judge the world and his own people. The members of the fourth philosophy emphasized the Jewish homeland and their divinely appointed right and duty to reestablish Israel as a sovereign state within it, by force if necessary. These then are the four major sects that we know about that arose within Palestine under foreign subjugation. In this lecture, I'd like to move a step further to consider some of the more explicit forms of opposition to Roman rule. I can begin by saying a few words in more detail about what it meant for Jews in Palestine to live in one of the Roman provinces. The common view that the Jews in Palestine suffered more than anyone else in the Roman Empire is in some respects just not true. The Roman imperial authorities treated the Jews of Palestine much like they treated the other conquered territories that they ruled as provinces. The empire, of course, covered a large territory, eventually spreading from what is now England and Spain in the west to Syria in the east, and what is now Central Europe in the north to northern Africa, including Egypt, in the south. So it's a very large area. The lands that Rome conquered were formed into provinces that were ruled either by Roman aristocrats who were appointed as governors. These would be people among the Roman elite who had risen up through the ranks of the Roman administration and then were given a province to rule. So many provinces were ruled by Roman aristocrats. Other provinces, though, were ruled by local aristocrats who were designated as client kings of Rome. They were actually kings of the provinces, but they were responsible to Rome, who were the ultimate authorities. When Jesus was born, all of Palestine was ruled by a client king, Herod the Great. When Jesus died, the northern part of Israel, called Galilee, was ruled by one of Herod's sons. But Judea in the south was ruled by a Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. And so with the death of Herod the Great, the territory was divided up. And so there's a difference between King Herod in the north, where Jesus himself was resident, and Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of the south. Both Roman governors and client kings had two principal obligations to the empire. Their obligations were to raise revenues and to keep the peace. Rome did not have a detailed set of federal regulations dictating how these goals were to be accomplished. But instead, they left it up to efficient administrators to do what was needed in view of local circumstances. And so there weren't federal laws the way that we think of today in our country, having federal laws that required how states or local municipalities might organize their affairs. There were some broad principles, but basically the local administrators, whether they were Romans or members of the local aristocracy, were given free rein so that they could raise the tax monies that Rome required and so they could keep the peace. The Romans did not have troops stationed throughout the conquered territories, the various provinces, as I indicated in an earlier lecture. Most Jews in Palestine probably had never seen a Roman soldier. Soldiers, instead of being located in the interior, in the provinces, were instead stationed on the frontiers. In the case of Palestine, the Roman legions were situated up in Syria to protect against invasion from those outside of the empire. Only when there was some kind of armed conflict within Palestine would the troops march in. In Palestine, the only troops that were present were a cohort of soldiers that were kept by the Roman governor at his residence in Caesarea on the coast. These local troops could be used in case of a local disturbance, but they basically stayed with the governor. It was customary for the governor to come to Jerusalem, the capital city of Judea, at the most incendiary time of the year, the annual Passover feast, when he would station his troops around the temple in order to quell any possible disturbances. The principal burden that Jews in Palestine bore as a conquered people was the requirement to pay taxes to the empire, like all other conquered people. Since the Roman economy was agrarian, taxation involved payment of crops and of monies to fund the armies and the infrastructure provided by Rome, including roads, bridges, and public buildings. In monetary terms, the Roman tax burden that Jews appear to have borne was no worse than those of other native populations in the provinces. It's difficult to calculate exactly how much people had to pay in taxes in the ancient world because our sources are so limited on this kind of information. But the most recent studies suggest that a typical Jewish farmer, and most Jews worked the land, a typical Jewish farmer was evidently taxed, on average, something like 12 or 13% of his income to support the Roman presence in the land. What has to be borne in mind, of course, though, is that this came on top of taxes that Jews had to pay to support the temple in Jerusalem and the local Jewish administration. And these tax burdens might have added an additional 20% or so to the total tax bill, so that the total taxes might have been something like a third of an average Jew's average tax bill, a third of his actual income. This may not seem exorbitant by the standards of today's highly industrialized nations. Many of us pay more than 30% of our income in taxes when you kind of calculate it all out. But we have to recall that in ancient agrarian societies, most farmers did well to eke out an existence in the best of circumstances. And so it was seen to be quite a burden, but no more excessive than many other local peoples. So my point is, though, on the one hand, Jews were treated like everybody else in the empire. Moreover, it needs to be conceded that in some ways the treatment of Jews was better than those of other inhabitants of the empire. Just in strict economic, social, and political terms, Jews were better off. Since the days of Julius Caesar, Jews were not required to supply Rome with soldiers from their ranks. Most other conquered peoples had to supply the Roman armies with troops. Jews were forgiven this responsibility since Julius Caesar, who was assassinated 40 years before Jesus was born. This was a favor to the Jews because of the help that the Jews had paid to Caesar's family during some of their conflicts, especially with Egypt. So the Jews were forgiven of this. There's a certain advantage to this for the Roman armies as well, since faithful Jews would refuse to serve every seventh day, and you can't really soldier very well if you're not going to fight on Saturdays. So in any event, they weren't required to serve. Nor were Jews required to provide direct support for Roman legions who were stationed nearby or when they're marching through the frontiers. That was another exemption Jews had. In one respect, though, of course, the Jewish situation could be seen as far worse than other peoples in the empire, in that many Jews considered it blasphemous to pay taxes to support the Roman administration of the land that God had given them, the Jews. I mean, nobody likes to live in a conquered territory, but Jews had a theology that God himself had given them this land. And so having to pay taxes on land that they themselves had been given by God was blasphemous to many Jews. And so in some ways, treatment of Jews was better than other people's, in another way it was worse. Jews reacted to the Roman administration of Palestine in a variety of ways. For many Jews, for example, the aristocracy, the Roman occupation probably had its advantages. We don't hear much about this kind of Jew in our sources, but there were probably lots of Jews who found it all right that the Romans were in charge of the land. After all, the Romans did provide infrastructure, and they did provide protection from hostile nations to the east, and that's all to the good. For other Jews, though, the Roman domination was intolerable, a political and religious nightmare. Throughout the first century, Jews of Palestine resisted Roman rule on a number of occasions and in a number of different ways. I'm going to talk about 5 different ways that Jews resisted Roman rule. I'm not saying all Jews resisted, or that all Jews resisted in these 5 ways, but these are 5 ways that some Jews in Palestine resisted the domination by Rome. First kind of Jewish resistance. Many Jews engaged in simple, silent protests against foreign rule. For example, during the Passover feast that I described in an earlier lecture. The Passover festival was explicitly a commemoration of God's deliverance of Israel from an oppressive foreign power in earlier times. The meal commemorated when Moses was raised up by God to deliver Israel from their subjection to the Egyptians. When Jews celebrated this feast, it wasn't only because they were thinking about what God had done in the past. Many Jews were celebrating the feast precisely because they anticipated that God would do something like that again. This time not against the Egyptians under Moses, but against Rome under the Messiah. Romans understood full well the political implications of the Passover feast. In other words, that it's a kind of a silent protest anticipating that God's going to deliver his people. That's why the Romans brought in troops for the occasion, lest disturbances broke out. On occasion, the Roman presence itself had the opposite of its desired effect. There's one instance we know about from the writings of Josephus, for example, just to pick one example, during the 50s A.D., so about some 25 years after Jesus was executed, under the reign of the Roman procurator Cumanus. Cumanus brought in the troops to Jerusalem during the Passover, stationed them around the temple, and according to Josephus, one of the soldiers thought that it would be humorous to moon the crowd. And so he lifted up his whatever they would wear, and he exposed himself to the crowds down below in the temple. The crowds below didn't think that this was particularly funny. This was their holy place, and in protest they picked up stones and started pelting the soldiers with stones. The messengers went off to Cumanus, who reported what was happening in the temple. He sent in reinforcements, and panic struck the crowds. And according to Josephus, who may have exaggerated the number, there was a huge surge of people, and Josephus says that 20,000 Jews were killed in the mayhem that ensued. Well, that's the sort of thing that could happen during Passover, a silent protest. Passover in Jerusalem was a particularly tense time. We should recall that Jesus was arrested and removed from the public eye during the Passover. That's probably not insignificant. Second kind of Jewish resistance. On some occasions, a Roman administrator would offend the Jews in Palestine, and they would respond through some kind of non-violent protest. This happened during Jesus' lifetime, when Pontius Pilate himself assumed the prefectorship of Judea in AD 26. When Pilate became the governor, he came into Jerusalem. He actually entered the city at night, and he had his soldiers set up standards throughout the city. These were standards that had the image of the emperor on them. These were stationed then throughout Jerusalem to indicate that the new governor had arrived. When Jews in the city woke up and found these standards throughout town, they erupted in protest and staged a kind of sit-in at Pilate's palace. This sit-in lasted for 5 days. Finally, Pilate got fed up with it and surrounded the Jewish people who were there protesting. He surrounded them 3 deep with soldiers, and ordered the soldiers to pull out their swords and threatened to murder the lot of them. These Jews responded, according to Josephus, by flinging themselves down onto the ground and saying that they'd rather have their heads cut off than to submit to this sacrilege. And Pilate, realizing that this probably wasn't a good idea, then backed down and removed the standards. This is a kind of non-violent protest against Roman rule that happened during Jesus' own day. So 2 kinds of protests so far. Kind of a silent protest during the Passover feasts and other times. Secondly, nonviolent protests. A third kind of Jewish resistance to Roman rule involved violent insurrections in Palestine that took place during the 1st century. These are incidents in which Jews planned and executed armed revolt against the Romans. Violent insurrections were not everyday occurrences. That's a point I should stress. These didn't happen all the time. They happened a couple of times in the 1st century. The incidents, in fact, were few and far between. But one of them, at least, led to horrendously disastrous results. This came 35 or 40 years after Jesus' death. Because of Roman atrocities, the Roman governor actually plundered the treasury of the temple in Jerusalem because he wanted to fund a project of his. Because of atrocities such as the plundering of the temple, there was a widespread revolt that emerged against the Romans. To quell the revolt, Romans sent in the legions from the north, which had been stationed up in Syria. And they quickly subjugated the Galilee, the northern part of the land. This is this incident that I mentioned before when the Jewish historian Josephus, before he was the Jewish historian, was an aristocrat who had been appointed to be general of the troops in Galilee. This is that incident. He led the troops in Galilee, but they were quickly overrun, and Josephus, as I've pointed out, then surrendered. A group of Galilean Jews, though, fled to Jerusalem and provoked a bloody civil war within Jerusalem in which they staged a coup against the priestly aristocracy that had been charged of the temple. This group of Galilean Jews is known to history as the Zealots. These Zealots took over control of the city, and once they had acquired control, they pressed the fight against the Romans to the very end. It led to a horrifying 3-year siege of Jerusalem, in which the Romans surrounded the city and didn't allow any supplies to get in, which led, of course, to massive starvation. It wasn't going to end well, and it didn't end well. Finally, the Romans broke through the walls, and there was a massive slaughter. This war ended in a complete bloodbath, in which tens of thousands of Jews were killed or enslaved. The rebel leaders were crucified. They just lined the streets with crosses. And much of the city itself was leveled. The temple was burned to the ground, never again, of course, to be rebuilt. Well, so there were, on occasions, this is the most extreme occasion, there were violent protests, in addition to the silent protests and the nonviolent protests. A fourth kind of Jewish resistance during the first century involved a more obviously, you might call, religious response to Roman opposition. Throughout the first century, we know of self-styled prophets who appeared, who predicted that God would soon intervene on behalf of his people to overthrow the forces of evil that ruled them. These people were not necessarily urging armed rebellion against the Romans. They were saying that God was going to intervene and overthrow the Romans. Some of these prophets had large followings. None of them, for obvious reasons, was well received by the Roman authorities themselves. I'll give you a couple of examples of these these Jewish prophets protesting Roman rule. Less than 15 years after Jesus' crucifixion, there was a prophet who was named Theudas. We don't know much about this person except for what we find in Josephus. The book of Acts in the New Testament also mentions him. Theudas apparently was a Jewish prophet. He was a Jewish prophet who apparently led a large crowd of Jews out of Jerusalem to the Jordan River. And there he publicly proclaimed that he was going to make the Jordan River part, allowing the people to cross back into Israel on the dry land. This was an obvious reference to the traditions of Israel's exodus from Egypt through the Red Sea, which Moses kind of parted. Moses parts the waters and people walk on the dry land. And then the conquest of the Promised Land, where again, when the people enter into the Promised Land, the Jordan parts and they enter in on dry land. And so this is a reference to, this is saying that Theudas is going to be the instrument through whom God once again brings back a sovereign state to the Promised Land. Well, the Romans knew what this was all about, and they heard about what was happening out there in the wilderness by the Jordan River, and so the Roman governor sent forth his troops, and they slaughtered Theudas and his followers and brought Theudas' head back to Jerusalem for display. Romans didn't take kindly to prophets who were predicting that God was going to bring an end to the Roman order. About a decade later, after Theudas, another prophet arose who is called by both Josephus and the book of Acts simply as the Egyptian. We don't know the name of this person. He's called the Egyptian. The Egyptian led a huge following. According to Josephus, it was 30,000 people outside of Jerusalem, and he predicted that he was going to make the walls of Jerusalem come tumbling down, which, again, is a clear allusion to the Hebrew Bible, in this case, not to the Exodus from Egypt, but to the Battle of Jericho under Joshua, when they marched around the city and blew the trumpets, and the walls came tumbling down. Once again, the Romans knew what this was about, that this was a prophet predicting that God was going to do something to destroy the enemy, and the Roman troops were sent out again, and a huge slaughter occurred. Those are two examples of sort of religious responses to Roman rule. A third example of this kind could be seen as John the Baptist, whom we know about from the New Testament, but also from Josephus. John the Baptist appears to have been a prophet of this type, predicting that God was soon going to intervene on behalf of his people and wreak a massive destruction and judgment. As John says in the sayings preserved in Q, "Who warned you?" he says to the people who've come to hear him. "Who warned you to flee from the wrath that's coming? Behold, the axe is lying at the root of the tree. Every tree that does not bear fruit will be cut down and cast into the fire." In other words, he's predicting that if people don't repent, God is going to enter into judgment with them, and it's going to happen right away. The axe is at the root of the tree. John also, of course, was executed by the ruling authorities. Other Jewish prophets arose and experienced similar fates. Roman administrators of Judea had no qualms about destroying anyone whose predictions that God would soon intervene on behalf of his people gained them a large and potentially riotous following, especially in Jerusalem. We should bear in mind this kind of scenario when we start to reflect on the life of Jesus, a Jewish prophet who gets executed in Jerusalem. Fifth and finally, an even more widely spread response to Roman rule involved a kind of religious ideology that had become popular during the period. This religious ideology may have originated, probably did originate, during the Maccabean revolt, but it had become enormously popular among the Jews of Palestine under Roman rule. This is an ideology that modern scholars have called apocalypticism. It was a view held by a number of Jews, probably by many of these prophets that I've just referred to. The term apocalypticism comes from the Greek word apocalypsis, which means a revealing or an unveiling. Apocalypticists believed that God had revealed to them the future course of events, in which he was going to bring a good kingdom on earth to replace the current evil kingdom. We know about Jewish apocalyptic thought from a number of ancient sources, such as the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Jewish apocalypticists appear to have subscribed to four major tenets of thought. Four major tenets characterize Jewish apocalypticists. First, Jewish apocalypticists were dualists. They maintained that there were two fundamental forces of reality, the forces of good and the forces of evil. And everyone and everything sides with one of these two forces. Everyone's on the side of God or on the side of Satan. You have angels on the side of God, you have demons on the side of Satan. You have life and righteousness on the side of God. You have death and sin on the side of Satan. Everything participates in one of these two forces. Moreover, the history of the world is divided into two ages. There's the present age that's ruled by the forces of evil, and the age to come that will be ruled by the forces of good. Two cosmic powers, two ages of the world, according to Jewish apocalypticists. So first, they're dualists. Second, they're pessimists. Jewish apocalypticists were completely pessimistic about the possibilities of life in the present evil age. It's the evil forces that are in charge now. Therefore, those who side with the good will be punished by the forces that are now in control. Moreover, these evil forces are gaining in power, so that things are going to go from being very bad to being very much worse. And there's nothing anyone could do to stop it. You can't improve your lot for these people, for example, by improving technology, by throwing more money into the welfare system, by putting more teachers into the classroom, by putting more cops on the beat. You can't improve society because it's forces of evil that are in control, and they're going to make it much worse. Third, apocalypticists believed that God was going to intervene in history, though, and overthrow the forces of evil to bring in his good kingdom. There was going to be a future judgment day in which God would overthrow the forces of evil. When he did so, he would raise people from the dead so that they would face judgment. There'd be a resurrection at the end of this age in which everybody would face their Maker. If they sided with the good, they'd be rewarded. If they sided with the evil, they'd be punished eternally. Fourth, apocalypticists maintained that this future judgment of God against the forces of evil and the appearances of his good kingdom on earth was an imminent event. It was going to happen right away. God's kingdom was almost here. How soon would it be? In the words of one famous Jewish apocalypticist from the first century, "Some of you standing here will not taste death before you see that the kingdom of God has come in power." These are the words of Jesus himself. Mark chapter 9, verse 1. "Truly I tell you," says Jesus, "this generation will not pass away before all these things take place." Jesus himself appears to have adopted an apocalyptic point of view. There were evil forces in the world, but God was soon going to intervene and overthrow them in a mighty act of judgment, and he would bring then his good kingdom to earth. This all was going to happen within Jesus' own generation. At least that's the point of view of Jesus that's presented in our earliest sources. Among the traditions that I think we can accept as most historically accurate, when considered in light of the three criteria we've already discussed. But that's going to be the topic of our next lecture.